and type, thank you, Nancy, and type your name and an affiliation into the chat. And that way we can kind of quickly and efficiently acknowledge everybody who's here and see the range of people and their affiliations who are here. So just open your chat and type in your name and department. Thanks, Cecile, for getting us started. And let's get that. Yep, great. Great. So exciting. So as that continues, I want to introduce my colleague, Doug Barrera, Associate Director for Faculty and Community Engagement at the Center. And Doug is going to take it from here to introduce our panelists and to kick off the discussion. Doug?
Thanks, Shalom, and welcome again, everybody. I'm so happy to see you all. And as Shalom mentioned, we think that this is a particularly appropriate topic. It's probably always appropriate, but particularly in light of what we saw, last summer, the kind of increased engagement that folks had around issues of racial injustice, calls for greater racial justice. We didn't want to let too much time pass without addressing this issue and within the context of community engaged pedagogy. So we're very excited and grateful to have three dynamic panelists with us today. I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then I've developed some guiding questions for them. Once
Nee, je kan het hele kasteel Zwijnstein kopen.
Oh, can I ask everybody just to mute their, beautiful, thank you. So I'm going to go through and ask the panelists questions, and we'll kind of do sort of a round robin. We'll go through asking each panelist some questions. I do want to invite folks to you can either place, if you have questions, we're going to reserve time at the end for some Q&A. If you want to put questions in the chat as we go, feel free to do so. I'll try to monitor those questions. In addition to that, you can also just kind of jot your questions down, reserve them, and then ask them at the end. And as I said, we're going to we'll reserve time at the end for that. So let's go ahead and get started. Let me introduce our panelists today. So we've got three folks on the panelists. We're joined today by Yusuf Omawale, who is a staff member of the Southern California Library. Founded almost 60 years ago, the Southern California Library is a library and archive located in South Los Angeles that documents and makes accessible histories of struggles that challenge racism and other systems of oppression. This archival labor is located within longstanding traditions of collective memory work to document the impacts of policing, incarceration, displacement, and dispossession. By necessity, this work has included political education workshops, organizing support, and offering spaces of healing and material aid to ease some of the day-to-day sufferings of late capitalism. We are also joined by Amy Ritterbusch, faculty member in the Department of Social Welfare at UCLA. Amy has led social justice-oriented participatory action research initiatives with street-connected communities in Colombia for the last decade and recently in Uganda. Her work involves the documentation of human rights violations and forms of violence exerted against homeless individuals, sex workers, drug users, and street-connected children and youth, and subsequent community-driven mobilizations to catalyze social justice outcomes within these communities. Throughout her research and teaching career, she has explored different approaches to engaging students and community leaders through critical and responsible interaction between classroom and street spaces in Colombia, Uganda, and now in Los Angeles through the lens of social justice-oriented participatory action research. Our third panelist is Dr. Stella Smith, who's the Associate Director for the Minority Achievement, Creativity, and High Ability Center and an adjunct instructor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Counseling at Prairie View A&M University. A qualitative researcher, Dr. Smith's scholarly interests focus on the experiences of faculty and administrators of color in higher education, African American females in leadership in higher education, diversity, equity, and inclusion of underserved populations in higher education, and P through 20 educational pipeline alignment. As the Anti-Racism Research Fellow with Collaboratory, Dr. Smith's work is working to develop criteria for what anti-racist community engagement looks like, exploring common characteristics, principles, focuses, etc., that are present when community-university partnerships are conducted in an anti-racist way. Dr. Smith hopes to develop an anti-racism scorecard that can develop institutions that can help institutions recognize and identify community-engaged anti-racist work and intentionally incorporate anti-racism work into efforts across campus. So welcome to our three panelists. Thank you so much for being here and for literally joining us from across the world as it turns out. And so I want to start, and this is a question for all of our panelists, and there's sort of a two-part, so you can either take it one at a time or you can take both parts. But the questions are these: why should community engaged courses address racial injustice? And what does it mean to you to apply an anti-racism framework to community engaged teaching? And Amy, why don't we go ahead and start with you, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation to join this space. I am joining from Colombia, and there's construction outside of where I'm staying, so I really apologize for the noise. So I guess the first part of this question, why should community engaged courses address racial injustice? I think that all of our curriculum, and especially pedagogies in this moment and spanning through the histories of injustice and racism in multiple country contexts, we should always think through engage anti-racist pedagogies in the classroom. And that is from each of our positioned pedagogical platforms. And so for me, what it means for me is to work with students to create a collective learning space. And so we always, like, as we're beginning, I'll give, to answer these questions, I'll give examples from my undergraduate course that I'm teaching, entitled Social Problems and Social Change. I definitely didn't make that title, but the idea of sort of a course about social change and the community engaged element of this, we create a collective learning space where we all position our racial and ethnic identities through reflexive essays, through arts-driven pedagogies, through really thinking through our window on the world. And racial injustice and racial violence is just one of those sort of themes that's addressed. I don't know if maybe I should stop there, and then I'll keep giving examples as we move through the questions, but thanks again.
Great, thanks, Amy. Yusuf, I'm wondering if you can answer the question, the same question, but thinking about it from the perspective of someone who works in the communities of Los Angeles, perhaps has or will have students coming to work with the Southern California Library. You know, why do you think it's important for this coursework and the framing for the students to have to do work in the community be framed around an anti-racism approach?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation as well. I think start broadly and then kind of go to more examples. One is that because we're in a geography of racial capitalism, that racism is embedded in wherever we are, all that we do. So whether or not we're explicitly doing anti-racist work, we're doing racial injustice work, so to speak, whether we know it or not. And so I think part of it is being intentional in trying to exist within the contradictions. We're not going to overturn racial capitalism tomorrow. So there's going to be a lot of failure. We're going to be implicated in sustaining it, but there's ways in which we can begin to address it. And so for us, if we understand racism not as an attitude, not as, I mean, it can be expressed in those ways, but that we're not so much trying to change people's psychology, but trying to change the structures and policies that create conditions that lead to our premature death and impact negatively our ability to live. And so those are the stakes in terms of the why question, is that our very lives are at stake if we're not intentionally engaging with the structures and factors that can lead to our death. I think the other part then to also consider is the notion of community. And so campus is also a community. I think a lot of times we talk about community as somehow outside of the normal academy. There's jobs and debt and joy and love and insurgency and all these things that happen in the academy. And so one is that you don't even have to necessarily leave the academy to do community engaged work. And so relooking at that way as well. Obviously, then we can talk about going out into places like where the library is located in South Central and doing partnerships. But I think if we begin to imagine community differently, it's almost like community is kind of like urban, where it's coded for certain specific things. So when I was in school, much less now, like we don't typically do community engaged work to study wealth and privilege, which I was always interested in. Like we're always going to the hood, but we never go to Beverly Hills, and other people have access to those environments. And so, but I think that's because of what we mean by community, which is the other. And it's inherently a very kind of colonial project to begin with. So I think those, and I'll stop here, but I think there's a lot more to say, but I think really starting with a reexamination of what we mean by racism and what we mean by community, then we can get into why it's important and how we may be able to engage it if we start looking at those factors differently.
That's great, Yusuf. Thank you for that. Stella, same questions to you. Why should community engagement, and particularly community engaged courses, address racial injustice, and what does it mean to you to apply an anti-racism framework to community engaged teaching? And thinking about that as we were talking, before the workshop started, as you've been listening to folks across the country, how does that inform your thinking about this?
So first, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm just so excited to hear from the other panelists. There's amazing responses to this question. And so one thing that we have to recognize in higher education, and this is similar to what Yusuf said, we are complicit in supporting systemic structures that maintain the power differential within this country. And so if we are going to go out and do external community work, then we need to understand what our role is in maintaining the current systemic power structures that we have. And so one way to do that, not the only way, because we are intersectional beings, so just our racial and ethnic, just only our racial and ethnic person perspectives, those aren't the only perspectives that we bring to the table, but we do need to identify and really be very mindful about how we are bringing those identities into a space that has often been historically marginalized. So when you think about community engagement work, one group who believes that they have something to offer generally goes into to another group and provides that. And so, there are very much well-intentioned people that want to have a reciprocal relationship with community. But in order to make sure that that occurs, I think often as you're going into community, you have to be very mindful, very genuine, very open about how you are going in and how you are assessing and listening to what community would like to have happen. So understanding that you are in partnership with, not doing something for another community when you're doing this work. the last part of the question, for me personally, it really starts with vulnerability and being honest. Because as like Yusuf said, you're going to stumble as you're doing this community work and you're building relationship. You might stumble. And so by being genuine and being honest, that gives you an opportunity to learn from each other. And in that learning, that's where growth happens. And that's where you can really begin to develop change and move the needle together.
Thank you for that. Okay, so Amy, I'm going to now come back to you and ask you, as someone who has taught these types of courses, and particularly as you're starting to dig into this work at UCLA, UCLA being on the quarter system, what are the challenges that you face in attempting to do this work, and particularly approach community engaged work from an anti-racist standpoint within a quarter length course, and kind of a short time period? And are there strategies that you've developed to address these challenges? Is there an example of work that you've kind of built into your course that you can point to, and that really has allowed you to embed an anti-racism framework into the broader community engaged work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's definitely, we've also had longer conversations about this, Doug, in terms of how to pursue community engaged pedagogies in a 10-week system. I think it's contradictory to the principles of community engagement, right? Where it's deep learning over time, relationship building, trust building, love, and mutual understanding, right? All of these things that take time to cultivate. And so I have definitely grappled with this in course design for the social change course that I mentioned, which I teach as sort of a social movement class. The way that I understand community engagement is learning from and with activists on the front lines, which doesn't necessarily mean, especially now when we're teaching, sort of when we have all of these different formations and ways of teaching, our pedagogies are limited to screens and we're distanced, and immersion is actually impossible right now. What does that look like? And so in my course, I developed a community conversations series where I invite activists who I have deep relationship with. And so it's sort of the relationship building and the dialogue and the learning happens through love and mutual understanding and struggle and collective work that's happened over time, not just central or sort of navel gazing around my work, because I think that's also really challenging and is important to think through when we're teaching community engaged courses, how not to center our particular understanding of social justice and social change and what justice seeking looks like. It is something that I want each student to explore in terms of their positionalities, in terms of the ways that they have enacted or exerted violence against others, in terms of ways that they have experienced violence or racial injustice, again, without sort of re-victimizing. And so I feel like the activities that we use in class is always this balance of careful reflection and lots of time to share space for collective reflection and also grieving collectively. And so, last spring quarter, with the murder of George Floyd, a lot of us experienced this in our pedagogies, that we had to hold space for this. And I think each collective learning environment did this in sort of their own way, because each classroom space is its own formation across differences. And so I'm forgetting actually the question that you asked, but I guess the challenge is timing. So how do we avoid the tendency of sort of community engaged bluffing or participatory bluffing, right? Which is just like the touch and go, arriving and extracting information or doing a project and leaving, but rather centering relationships. And so a lot of what we do in the social movement class that I'm mentioning is individual and collective reflection from our formation as a classroom, and working with activists who are actually our maestros or professors. I'm accompanying these activists on the front lines who generously share their knowledge with students, and the exchange, and also the things that I've read in their reflexive essays after the community conversation series. There's 5 of them over the course of those 10 weeks, is really powerful. And each student has a different sort of, a different way of relating to that knowledge. And I guess the last thing that I would say, I think it's really important to destabilize sort of the hierarchies of our pedagogical praxis, right? And so in sort of decentering a tenure track or adjunct or whichever professor has the power in that space, and really centering the voices and the knowledge of those on the front lines, doing the daily work of anti-racist work and work on the front lines. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Amy. So Yusuf, let me now turn to you, and Amy has just outlined so many of the considerations of doing this work and ways of thinking of doing this work, and really kind of reimagining, the sort of typical, as she was talking about the pedagogical hierarchies, the ways in which we privilege which knowledge is considered valid in higher ed, by bringing in these co-educators as part of this process. What are your thoughts about the ways in which faculty should approach teaching community engaged courses from an anti-racist perspective? What are some of the things that you would want? So we've got a room full of folks who either have or are in the process of thinking through, community engaged teaching, community engaged pedagogy. What advice would you give to folks, or what would you want them to know about what's happening within communities, or the ways in which to approach communities in doing this work?
And so again, I think existing within racial capitalism speaks to some of the impossibility of doing this work. And so that because of the structures of the academy support the existing order, they don't necessarily support what we would consider to be community engagement. And so one of the things would be looking at, if we understand, again, racism not so much as attitude, but as structural, and there's a political economy attached to it. One of the first things is to look at the political economy of community engaged work and who's able to participate and not from an academy side, right? So there's a lot of students that are from the so-called community in classes at UCLA, but because of their life circumstances, it's more difficult to participate in sustained community engaged work. Now, maybe if in their class, they're able to do that, but a lot of those kinds of opportunities become difficult. And in the same token, I think for faculty, depending on their own position, depending on incentive structures. So do you have to publish? Where do you need to publish? You can't publish in the libraries, zine or something. That's not going to get you good academic reviews. And so one of the first things is some of that organizing to look at how do we change some of the structures and incentives that make up the political economy of engagement, particularly so that people who are from these communities, because again, we're not generally studying wealth, can participate. I think in terms of the 10-quarter system or 10-week, whatever, is transcending the time of the academy, right? And so not necessarily having projects be student-centered, but be based in a relationship with a faculty in a community organization or the department. So there's a more of a long-term sustained engagement that doesn't just begin and end with the students' 10 weeks. Part of it is also then looking at what are the tasks and the jobs of the students, because typically folks want students to do something interesting, which is great, but they're usually not prepared to do something more generative in community settings for a variety of reasons, and particularly within 10 weeks. And so thinking about what does relationship and trust building look like, what is the labor of that, and how can we reimagine that differently in terms of some of the pedagogy, relooking assessment and how we define success and learning. So if you've got to have a certain kind of product at the end of 10 weeks, that can be very difficult. Again, because as we're talking about the community building or being in community, doesn't necessarily have a fixed kind of timeline, or like in 3 weeks, you'll be at this stage of development or relationship. And so there might be a class where things don't work out or things take longer. And so how can you, again, kind of have a more transcendent notion of assessment and what success might look like. And also, I think it was mentioned earlier, like, how can we share vulnerability and risk? So I think typically as community partners, we're in a very different positionality in relationship or to our relationships with people in the academy. And sometimes even for us, like if it doesn't go well, then there's people in the academy that have a lot of power and we might miss out on future grants because now they don't like us, right? And so there's different kinds of vulnerability and risk that we take on, even just taking a project. And so I think what does that look like for faculty and students to share in that, in terms of what they're dealing with on campus, in terms of what they're taking on. So, and there might even be this in terms of ways to partner, but are there ways that maybe faculty, particularly again, a lot of faculty we may partner with don't have tenure, don't have permanency. They might not be able to name another faculty that's doing intellectual work that's harming our communities, and they won't be able to name them. And so how can we share a project where then maybe we can name them from a community position? But the other kind of side of that is faculty tend to be very romantic about community organizations. And so more than just, you don't have to necessarily agree with our politics, but at least send out students not to just valorize a community organizing effort, but to, again, looking at it critically, right? So for us this summer, and I was just looking up John Wooden because he has, from UCLA, has a quote, not all, or never mistake activity for achievement. So for us, like this summer was in a lot of ways a failure of cultural and pedagogical institutions like the Southern California Library, and that so many people were repeating justice as kind of a carceral logic of locking up police. And so you don't necessarily, the students or faculty don't have to agree with us that inherently a lot of the discourse and work of Black Lives Matter is actually anti-Black, but at least how can you go into communities and be critical both of us and other organizations rather than just like, oh, this is the real work, this is organizing. And that's typically what we see. And so those are some of, there's probably more, some of the concrete ways, I think, or not, I guess they're more abstract, but ways that faculty can begin approaching this work differently, hopefully, to come up with, if we ask different questions, maybe we can come up with a different set of answers and different structures for our partnerships.
Yeah, I think, what some common themes that we're hearing is the need for developing sustained relationships, understanding this work through sustained relationships, even if that means, and likely won't mean, sort of requiring students to sustain those relationships, that they're sustained at other levels, and that you know, as Amy was saying, and now Yusuf, as you were saying, starts to develop more of a horizontal relationship between the faculty members, the sort of the institution of UCLA, and work that's happening in the community. I think in some ways, so, you know, there's this balance that folks need to find with being reciprocal and respectful, and being conscious of you know, the historical damage that oftentimes that higher education has inflicted upon its local communities, while not being afraid to think critically about the work. And in some ways, I think that is also a product of, you know, more kind of even, you know, more of these sort of horizontal relationships. You know, if it's a true relationship, if it's a true relationship of trust, then you're less concerned about a critique, a fair and deep critique, than you are if it is a very sort of surface level relationship that's based upon, you know, for lack of a better term, kind of walking on eggshells. So Stella, so Yusuf just talked about, among the things he talked about was this idea of assessing success and what success in these relationships looks like. That is, you know, right in line with the work that you are doing with Collaboratory, the work that I guess, you know, that you're doing overall about assessing community engagement from an anti-racism perspective. Can you tell us a little bit about what you have started to learn about, you know, the approaches that universities are taking with a specific anti-racism framework in mind, and whether, and if so, this work is being assessed, or you've seen examples of the assessment? What does that look like, or even what are people talking about, the ways in which, you know, they're thinking about assessing this work?
Thank you, Doug. So yes, with Collaboratory, we've had 3 community dialogues, which were amazing, that have made the situation more complex than I had originally thought. You know, my initial proposal was to come up with a quantitative scorecard in order to look at and assess where an institution currently is, in order to help that institution move the needle towards more anti-racist community engagement. And what we found, and what people are telling us, is that it's much more complex than that in terms of, we really need to understand the intent behind the community engaged activity. And there needs to be a mixed methods and a qualitative and a quantitative kind of assessment measure in order to really determine how an activity is moving more towards an anti-racist engagement strategy. And so, you know, it's difficult to measure intent. And so the way that where the work stands now for me is really thinking about, okay, how do we do that? How do we measure the intent? And then how do we make sure that we have quantitative measures that are accurately interpreted in order to show that these activities have moved the needle? But some of the takeaways that I found from the work that we've done is that many people have these kind of qualitative anecdotal ideas around the movement towards anti-racist engagement. But even with those, you know, institutions being part of this kind of systemic power structure, they want quantitative kind of measures. They want to be able to demonstrate in a way that speaks the language of higher education that these activities have moved the needle. So we have to figure out what is the middle ground the sweet spot in terms of assessment, where we provide the institution what it needs, but we also make sure that we don't spend so much time trying to create this quantitative measure that we lose the intent of the activity altogether. And so one thing that I'm hearing in both of my colleagues' comments is also about how much is the institution really connected to this community engagement activity? Because you can have an individual faculty member that is extremely invested and engaged, but if these relationships need to be for a longer period of time and you need to have more support for these relationships, at some point these ideas, this community, the anti-racist community engagement pedagogy needs to be internalized within the institution. And so the work that I'm focusing on is really about systemic change. So although it is driven by the personal, it's driven by what we think and what we do. I'm really looking more at a systemic and an institutional level when I'm looking at what these assessments look like. So you asked the $1 million question: how are people doing these assessments? And the truth of the matter is, from the dialogues that I've had, the assessments for anti-racist work is just the same as the assessments for non-anti-racist work. It was very difficult for people to describe how it was different. And I think that is also part of the problem, because we've never, it has been difficult for us to even come up with the metrics and the language that helps us move the needle. You know, we know what it feels like, we know how to do it, but in terms of trying to measure it, it's been very difficult. And so those are the things that we're grappling with. But I think having the conversation about it, and also insisting that that conversation be institutional, is a very much a key to getting these measures and getting the sustained support for anti-racist community engagement, which will support those faculty members who might be on a 10-week system that want to do this work, that you have the resources and the support to do that work. And so it got more complex, not less. But I'm really still excited about, one, how many people are doing this work. And I just applaud everybody that is doing this work. As I know that it is difficult, particularly within a system that might not always be supportive of the work that you're doing. And then also, you know, the idea that people really want to have some kind of assessment, that makes me, I'm really excited about that too, because I know as a think tank, as a collaborative, we can work together to develop both those quantitative and qualitative assessments that will allow us to measure these engagements.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Stella. And it occurs to me as I'm listening to our panelists, you know, that that one of the most important themes, which I guess seems, you know, sort of obvious, is the fact that if we are going to approach this work from an anti-racist standpoint, it requires everyone to think critically and to really be vulnerable to the sort of the result of that critical thinking. For example, if we are going to assess at the institutional level the support behind doing this kind of work, then we have to feel that, you know, we can speak up when, you know, the assessment has demonstrated that the university is not doing this work in a particularly good way, and we have to be open to these other, you know, thinking about the structures of academia in very different ways. So I think that point of, you know, again, some of the, you know, what we've seen kind of across the responses is, you know, really for this work to occur to the degree that it needs to, and Stella, you talked about, you know, really being able to measure how the needle is moving forward, that it's likely that the needle is not going to move if we continue to try to squeeze in this pedagogy into the typical academic framework and the way that, you know, we've thought about academic courses forever. I want to open it up to all of you, to all of our attendees, for any questions you might have of our panel in the time that we have left. So please, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or you can just you can click the little raise your hand icon, or you can even just speak up. Either way. Yeah, Cecile.
Hi, this was so wonderful. So I'm very, very grateful for all your contributions. I'm very inspired, and I'm kind of new on that either practice or set of concerns thanks to UCLA. So I'm extremely eager to learn and to think through things with you. I think I would just have like a list of priorities for me at this kind of like early stage of figuring out how to do those things, and maybe that may help out. Just as a summary, I feel like there might be 4 areas that I would like to kind of be transparent about or work with. One being the authenticity and positionality that you outlined, Stella, in my work, and how I want to learn and really think through what I don't know and how I want to learn about it and who I turn to learn more about this. So that's at the kind of like core of my teaching, regardless of content or strategy. Then I want to think carefully about how I am a gatekeeper. I don't want to be one, but I'm part of an academia that kind of like asks to kind of like sort through people and say that they are hierarchies. So I want to make sure that when I do this extremely carefully and in a socially engaged way. So that's the second part. Then I very much want to think about the kind of content I want to deliver and to kind of like adapt to the complex educational goals that are given to me by my department or my division, but also how to kind of connect them with communities around me. And I take your point that it doesn't have to be communities in the sense that we understand them. It has to be communities in general. So regardless of class or status. And then eventually, I absolutely would like to think also about outcomes. And so when we think about reciprocity of value and what is a long-lasting contribution, of course, we are kind of kept by the strictures of a 10-week quarter. But I'm very much interested in thinking about the goals for the students, because you know, I think that Amy's right in saying that we have to think about them in terms of introspective beings, and so how they think about the world and they see it and will have an impact on how they behave in the world. So that's wonderful. But I also would love to think about what kind of tools we can deliver them so that they can then apply those tools in the world. And so those are my 5 or 4 areas of questions. And so I want to learn from you guys.
Thanks, Cecile. Thanks for that comment. Let me I'm just thinking about, you know, based on what you know, the comments that Cecile made about being gatekeepers. I'm also very much struck by, you know, Yusuf, your comment about, you know, how we define the community and which communities we're typically going into. I wonder in some ways what would be the response if we started in community engaged courses, started having students working in the neighborhoods surrounding the UCLA campus. And Stella, if you're not familiar, UCLA happens to be bordered by Bel Air to the north, Brentwood to the west, and Beverly Hills to the east. So it is in like the one might say the epicenter of American wealth and capitalism to some extent. But I wonder what that would, you know, typically, and you know, I'm certainly, this is my, you know, MO is when I teach community engaged courses, I have students working with organizations that are serving people of color, typically in neighborhoods that are populated by people of color, low-income neighborhoods. I wonder, and I would just open this up to the panel, but also anybody else who's joining us, you know, what do you think the response would be, either from students or maybe from the community at large, if we were to start to send students into some of these surrounding neighborhoods and asking them, particularly if we were approaching this from, you know, framing the work from an anti-racist or even sort of a racial capitalism, or just, you know, within the terms of race. You know, it is that classic thing of when we talk about race, we never talk about white folks. But what would that look like if we were actually doing that work? I'm wondering if anybody has thoughts.
I think that's a very provocative, like I'm turning on it, you know, because when we think about the definition of anti-racist community engagement, of course, like you said, I also connect that to power differential. And so when I think about who's got power and who might not have power, those communities in which you mentioned seem to me to be saturated with power. So that would not be a community that I would think would be needing resources. That doesn't mean that that's true. It just means that that's, you know, that's what automatically comes to my mind. So it seems like some education, and this was also part of the work with Collaboratory, you know, what is anti-racist community engagement actually defined as? How are we really defining that term? Because I think different people, based on their lived experiences, define that differently. And so if we don't have, or if we have different definitions of what it is, then the idea that a student who's in a community doing community engaged work is going into that community might appear different to some people than it would to other people. But I think it's really a provocative question, and really a question that needs to be dived into. Why? Why is that? Why would that be a challenge? Why is there not something within the experience of those individuals that we don't want to learn, or we don't want to be, that wouldn't need to be supported? So that's a great question.
If anybody wants to jump in, but because I think the initial question wasn't so much how can students be of service, or how can they provide resources, right? But about like, what would an anti-racist engagement look like? And I think a big part of what an anti-racist pedagogy would be is making the world more legible in terms of the power structure and what things that get normalized and that are not visible to all communities. And so it's not even so much about being of service, but in terms of making what's going on in Bel Air, and not just in Bel Air, but the relationships that Bel Air has to our Harvard Park neighborhood in South Central, making those relationships more legible. And so I can see where one quarter of students are going to Bel Air, and maybe the second quarter they're coming to the library and working with Harvard Park residents in the hood to talk about what's going on in Bel Air, and to make more legible those relationships that are not even visible always to people in Harvard Park, although probably more to people in Harvard Park than Bel Air. So I would say that I think in terms of the gatekeeper, I think part of it is acknowledging that we're all gatekeepers, right? In different ways, in different positionalities. And so it's not so much like not to be a gatekeeper, but acknowledging that you are, and then how do you exist within that contradiction to benefit more people? And that goes for all the different kinds of positionalities we have, because if you come to the library, there's people that are so-called gangs that are gatekeeper to a whole world that you don't have access to. And so it's not gatekeeping of itself that is much the issue. But how we navigate those contradictions. And so lastly, just in terms of methods and those things, I think it's also for students as well as for our communities, what kind of methodologies can we access that can make these things more legible, right? So that when UCLA puts out a $500,000 report on the benefits of community policing in neighborhoods like where the library is that removes Black bodies, it's more legible to folks, right? When I did a presentation with a community engaged learning class, they had watched a documentary on poverty, and like the 100 students thought that this film was like a progressive left-leaning documentary, but it was actually funded by the DeVos family. And it was not legible to anybody in the course. And so And that's not to say anything about the class, because I think this is what the world that we live in, right? And that the aspects, the lived realities and structures of racial capitalism are invisible. And that's, for us, what we see as kind of anti-racist education. So if y'all are interested in going into Westwood and there's any way that we can help, we would love to do that.
One thing that I would add is to think beyond sort of physical space, like the spatialities and the geographies of community engagement, but rather staying focused on the relationships. And so how, given the learning objectives of any of our courses, how do we, how can we build out different activities that can guide students' process of learning and exchanging? And again, thinking beyond, students, each individual student in each learning collective, which is the way that I like to think of the classroom, reaches out in their own individual spaces to learn and to think through the course material. But then there's also some sort of collective learning that happens somewhere and hopefully beyond the traditional classroom space. But I definitely think that, thinking beyond borders and thinking beyond this traditional notion of what is the campus, what is the university, and breaking down some of those things is really, there's so many brilliant opportunities, especially in this moment when we're having to rethink our pedagogies and the geographies of our pedagogies and how we share space with students. So those are just some thoughts.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I think a lot of our kind of reframing and rethinking and our almost some of our instinctive is to think of community engagement as performing some kind of a service. And when we talk about, and Stella, you talked about it, and we talk about it all the time at UCLA, the reciprocal nature of these partnerships. And in some ways, I think whether, implicitly or explicitly, it causes us to frame engagement from a kind of a service mentality, even if we're talking about doing research, or if we're talking about, kind of joining advocacy efforts, and still thinking about how do we provide this thing to our communities as we're thinking about community engagement. And I think that there is a need to just start to even examine those communities around us and start to engage in these questions and these topics that have emerged here. Okay, we are just about out of time. I want to thank our three panelists again for joining us, literally from all over the place, from LA, from